So I got my blacksmithing gear when I was about 48. And by the time I was 50, I had figured out a couple of things. Number one, I loved blacksmithing and I wanted to do it into my retirement. And number two, I was getting old and I was getting weak and I was going to need some kind of a crane in the shop. So I did just a little talking around, and I had kept my eyes open, in construction, up until then, and I had put a little crane on my truck years before. And so I knew there were three broad general categories of crane that I could consider in my shop. There's bridge cranes, but I couldn't really consider that because they're big and they're grand and they're expensive, and I couldn't afford it. It wouldn't go in this building. There were gantry cranes that you roll around on a concrete floor, but I didn't have a concrete floor then, and I don't have a concrete floor now, and so that meant what I needed in here was a jib crane. And that's what this thing is. And let me tell you this, that has been a game changer in this shop for me. So I'm going to tell you kind of what I had to go through to find that old crane, to modify that crane so it would go into this space, the things that it does for me, and frankly, sometimes the things that I wish that it would do for me, because you might be thinking about putting some kind of lifting capacity in your shop. And there might be some things you ought to think about before you commit yourself to something that costs some money, is a good piece of work, and it's going to change the stars for you in your shop from now on if you do it. So I don't know how it works for you, but I've noticed over the years that more often than not, if I start thinking I need something, and then it turns out that I wasn't kidding and I really do need it, and I start to keep my eyes open and I start to include it in conversations, for one reason or another, it shows up. That's how it worked with this old boy. I had been thinking about a jib crane, and then suddenly one day I pulled into Garrettson's Building Supply, and I'd been pulling in there for years, and I noticed right over the fence at the back of where they have their roofing stacked over there on the east side, there was this piece of yellow iron laying in the weeds over there on the neighbor's property. And sure enough, I looked a little closer and I decided I need to have that. So I took a run at him, but we were just too far apart on price. We weren't even close. So over the next 8 years, I kind of kept my eye on it and got ready and was thinking about where I would put it. And on a particular day, a particular week, we came to terms. And then Garrettson's was good enough to load it up with they've got a crane on a truck, and they loaded it up for me, and I brought it home and started figuring out how to put this thing in the shop so that it would cover all the space that I needed to cover, lift everything that I thought I might need to lift, and be something that I would be able to do with the tools I had at my disposal. And let me tell you what, that was not an easy set of dynamics to line up. The first problem was, once I got it home and looked it over, I realized that this Hercules crane made by Hercules Industries, I don't even know if they're still in business, the capacity was great. It's a 2-ton crane. That's plenty stout for what I want to do. But it only operated through about 190 degrees of its circumference. It was made to go against the wall of a shop and just operate out into the floor. Problem was, I needed to operate from clear back there for storage, all the way around across the work area of the shop, over the drill press, over the propane forge, and swing around and service the coal forge and the power hammer back behind me. I needed about 260 degrees of rotation. So I began to look over these knuckles, the connection points between the jib and the column, and it turned out I needed to modify them. Well, that's all right. I'm a welder, so I did. I cut the top one apart, stretched it out, welded it back, and just clipped the corners off of the I-beam on the jib itself so that it would swing around tighter to the column before everything came tight. This thing used to drop the pin right through that hole, and I just had to extend it about 4 inches in order to get some clearance right there. The next challenge was that it was right up against the power hammer, right over against a truss, and it had to be the right distance away from 2 poles supporting this pole barn and clear everything. Because the last thing that I wanted to have happen was go through the drill of locating these anchor bolts. By the way, these anchor bolts were made in Cy Swan's shop. They're 1.25" rebar, 48 inches long. The concrete goes down 48 inches from the top of that piece of rebar right there. It's a 7-yard footing. It's about 7 feet square. It's a chunk. So the first challenge was to locate where it needed to go. The second challenge was to dig the hole. The third challenge was to suspend that anchor bolt template perfectly over the hole so that when it came time to stand this crane up, it was going to be timed or oriented correctly so that it traveled through the right distance of rotation to do all the work I needed it to do. So I want you to imagine my anxiety or excitement, optimism, and dread. How about that? Optimism and dread. After I had poured the footing, the anchor bolts were in place, I had set the leveling nuts, I stood the tower up on the leveling nuts, tied it down, put the jib on, and had to do a test flight. I had to know if I had the knuckles adjusted so that I could bring it clear around back here. Yes, storage. And then I began the nerve-wracking sweep of bringing that jib around to see if I missed that pole right there. And as it turned out, I did by about 1 inch. There's clearance, but just barely. But it swings over the top of the drill press with lots of room to operate. I can stock and move the fly press from that spot. I can back a truck in here and load it and unload it. It comes over the top of the propane forge, so I can lift that to replace the floor or swing a piece of heavy iron in. We missed that pole by probably as much as 7 inches. And then the last hurdle to jump was whether or not it would come around far enough to service the coal forge and the power hammer. And it does, with, maybe 6 inches of angular rotation to spare. So anyway, if you've got a concrete floor, maybe you can go with a gantry crane. If you've got a clear span engineered metal building, maybe you can put up a bridge crane. But if you can't, get a jib crane. Put it in the right spot, and you're going to produce a lot more work with it than you could without it. But I'll tell you, the key to the whole thing for me, as in so many other areas of my life, is the people I know who know the things that I don't know and can do the things that I can't do, who are willing to share that expertise with me. And now with this thing, there's some things that I can do for them and for the other friends and the people that come and go and cross my path and leave an imprint. And I have one little chance to leave an imprint, maybe, in their life. How are you going to beat that? Thanks for watching Essential Craftsman, and keep up the good work.